In the early hours of the 6th of October 1973, the phones of Israel's political and military leaders were ringing. Eli Zeira, the director of Israel's Military Intelligence Directorate, had learned through what he believed was an indisputable source that there would be a joint Egyptian and Syrian attack on Israel at 6 p.m. that day. Word reached Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, and Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, General David Elazar, shortly after 4:30 a.m. The news stunned them. They had believed assurances from Israeli military intelligence that there was a low probability of war, and they were unprepared. Israeli intelligence had failed to identify the correct time of the Arab attack, and at shortly after 2 p.m, Egypt and Syria commenced their assault. The Israeli army was caught completely off guard by the offensive on two fronts, with its reserve forces, 2/3 of its strength, still being mobilized. Egypt and Syria had chosen to attack on the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, with Jews across the world spending the day fasting and gathered in synagogues for intensive prayer. Israel would come to a virtual standstill, and the Arab nations believed it would give them an advantage. Prior to the Yom Kippur War, there had already been 3 major Arab-Israeli wars. This was the 4th war, just 6 years after the previous conflict. While tense coexistence had endured between Jews and Muslims in the region for hundreds of years, tensions and conflict would ignite again between Arab peoples, Jews, and Britain at the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was dissolved. In 1920, Britain was given a mandate by the League of Nations to administer the territory of Palestine until it was able to stand alone. Britain had made conflicting commitments to various groups during the war to garner support, and in 1917 published the Balfour Declaration, a public statement announcing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, then part of the majority Muslim Ottoman Empire with a small minority Jewish population. This was the first acknowledgement from an imperial superpower that the Jews had a historical connection to the land of what would become Israel, but the declaration was specifically vague, as there was no plan on how a national home would be achieved. In the 1920s and 30s, Jewish immigration to the region increased significantly, fueled by Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933. This led to riots from the Arab population and violent confrontations. They demanded independence from Britain and the end of what they perceived to be open-ended Jewish immigration and land purchases. In response, Britain originally proposed partitioning the land, but this was rejected by the Arab people and a revolt broke out. The government then issued the White Paper of 1939, which stated that the Balfour Declaration had only called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and with over 450,000 Jews already in Palestine, they had fulfilled the declaration. It stated that Britain would work towards the establishment of an independent state in Palestine over the next 10 years, and put restrictions on Jewish immigration and any further purchase of land. This outraged the Jewish population, who felt betrayed, but their options were limited. Despite the restrictions, during the Second World War, the Jewish population increased further, as Zionist organizations facilitated illegal immigration for Jews fleeing persecution. Exhausted by the combination of the First and Second World Wars, and intent upon withdrawing from the Middle East, Britain announced they would terminate the mandate and return the question of Palestine to the UN, who in 1947 proposed a partition plan with creation of independent Arab and Jewish states and an internationalized Jerusalem. This was accepted by the Jews, but rejected by the Arabs. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of a Jewish state to be known as the State of Israel, with Gurion as the first Prime Minister. Immediately following the announcement, 5 Arab nations invaded the former Palestinian mandate to protect Arab-designated areas, and also to launch an attack against the Jewish-designated areas, now named Israel. This marked the start of Israel's so-called War of Independence, the First Arab-Israeli War. The fighting ended in 1949, and the State of Israel controlled the area that the UN had proposed for the Jewish state, almost 60% of the areas proposed for the Arab state, and West Jerusalem, which was meant to be internationalized. Jordan took control of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. The surrounding Arab states refused to recognize Israel. 700,000 Palestinian refugees fled their homes in the areas that had become Israel. The Second Arab-Israeli War occurred in 1956 when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalised the foreign-owned Suez Canal and blocked the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. He did so without any political consultation, which shocked the UK and France, who owned the majority shares in the canal operating company. Israel wanted to regain shipping entry through the Straits of Tiran, but was also concerned about the large amount of Soviet weaponry that Egypt had obtained, and saw this as a narrow opportunity to weaken a dangerous hostile state. Israel, France and Britain combined forces to repossess the canal, but political pressure from the US and USSR forced them to withdraw. Nasser was defeated, but his regime survived. Israel gained military confidence, but withdrew only after they had secured American assurances over freedom of navigation in the Straits of Tiran. The UN created the UN Emergency Force, or UNEF, peacekeepers to police the Egyptian-Israeli border, and Israel asserted that any future closures would be a justification for war, entitling Israel to exercise its right to self-defense. There was no peace agreement after the 1956 war, and tensions between Israel and Egypt continued. Nasser pursued a policy of unification with like-minded Arab states, chiefly Syria. In 1967, tension along the Israeli-Syrian border peaked due to disputes concerning regional resources of water, testing Nasser's rhetoric concerning Arab solidarity. A series of small-scale militant attacks started in May, and Israel held Syria responsible. Syria responded with claims Israel was planning a large-scale attack and claimed Egypt would join in mutual self-defense. Israel ruled out the possibility of war, believing that they had a safe margin of superiority over any combination of Arab forces likely to attack it, and they did not believe the Arab states would rush to one another's assistance. This belief was tested when the Egyptian army rolled forward into the Sinai towards the Egyptian-Israeli border. Nasser then demanded the withdrawal of the UNEF peacekeeping force. Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tried to cool down the situation and made a speech stating that Israel was not preparing for an offensive. Nasser's response only added fuel to the fire. He claimed he was ordering troops to the border in light of information that Israel was amassing 13 brigades along the Israeli-Syrian border. Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping again. With further Arab states moving towards Israel's borders, on the 5th of June 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War began, when Israel launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. Nearly all of Egypt's military assets were destroyed, giving Israel the advantage of air supremacy. Simultaneously, Israel launched a ground offensive into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. Jordan and Syria joined the war. After 6 days, a ceasefire was agreed, giving the conflict its name, the Six-Day War. The Arab nations suffered 20,000 casualties, with Israeli losses estimated at less than 1,000. Israel had seized Syria's Golan Heights, the Jordanian-annexed West Bank, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. The ceasefire lines had completely altered the layout of Israel's map, and between 280 and 325,000 Palestinians and 100,000 Syrians fled or were expelled. The magnitude of the Arab defeat in 1967 created the inevitability of the next war. Israel had failed to bring peace with any Arab state, and their brilliant military victory gave rise to a delusion of power and complacency, while the deep sense of humiliation strengthened the Arab resolve to avenge their defeat and regain their pride. Israel believed that their neighbours would now be ready to talk peace, but Nasser refused to admit defeat and allow Israel to dictate peace terms. In August 1967, leaders from 13 Arab states gathered at the Arab League Summit and announced the Khartoum Resolution, which became known as the Three No's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. Over the next 3 years, numerous clashes between Israel and Egypt took place over the Suez Canal, the so-called War of Attrition between 1967 and 1970. This period witnessed sporadic but sometimes intense fighting between Israel and its Arab neighbours, while Egypt, with major Soviet assistance, tried to rebuild its armed forces. In 1970, Nasser died suddenly and was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. The War of Attrition had not budged Israel from the Suez Canal, and diplomatic efforts from the international community had also failed. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir was confident of Israel's geopolitical situation, and there was a lack of effective international pressure for Israel to return territory gained in 1967. She rejected Defense Minister Moshe Dayan's suggestion in December 1970 that Israel pull back 20 miles from the canal in order to enable its reopening, and thereby reduce Egyptian motivation for going to war. In 1971, Sadat astonished the world when he declared his readiness to achieve a peace agreement with Israel, in return for the Israeli withdrawal from all territories captured in the Six-Day War. Israel was only prepared to withdraw to so-called mutually defined boundaries, not the pre-war boundaries, with justification from Moshe Dayan that any peace achieved by pulling back to the vulnerable pre-war borders would be short-lived because it would make another war too tempting for the Arabs. For several months in 1971, negotiations continued on the issue of a partial settlement, but no progress was made. After the Israeli rejection, in June, Sadat announced his readiness to sacrifice 1 million Egyptian soldiers and claimed that 1971 would be the year of decision. When this threat was not followed through on at the end of 1971, the Israelis began mocking Sadat with references to the 32nd of December. During this time, the Soviet Union and the United States were experimenting with what was called détente. The Soviets attempted to discourage the Arabs from a military confrontation and refused to provide certain weapons, making it clear to Sadat that he could not rely on support from the Soviets in regaining the Sinai. Sadat also tried to improve relations with the US, in the hope that they would pressure Israel back to the international border, but to no avail. With the failure to secure even partial Israeli withdrawal, Sadat came to the conclusion that only a major military operation across the Suez Canal would jar both Israel and the two superpowers out of their lethargy towards Egypt and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Sadat knew that the Egyptian army would be unprepared to win a general war against Israel, so he decided on a limited war. His objective was to seize a foothold on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal and leverage the gains to negotiate a return of the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula. He needed to discredit the Israeli security theory, the Israeli belief that they were invincible against any Arab attempts to regain lost territories and could therefore dictate the peace terms from a position of strength. Sadat also wanted Egypt to regain pride and a place in international politics. The Egyptian assault would become known as the Yom Kippur War. Despite making early gains, Egypt suffered eventual military defeat, but their initial success in the war enhanced their prestige, and Israel realized there was no guarantee they could always dominate militarily. This paved the way for the Israeli-Egyptian peace process. In 1979, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed a peace treaty where Egypt would become the first Arab country to recognize Israel, and the Sinai Peninsula would be returned to Egypt, for which Begin and Sadat would both win a Nobel Peace Prize. For Syria, however, the Yom Kippur War delivered no strategic success. Their military aim had been to take back the Golan Heights, which they had not achieved. Syria voted with other Arab states in 1979 to expel Egypt from the Arab League for normalizing relations with Israel. We were able to make these videos thanks to our amazing patrons. Thank you to all our new patrons, and to Ryan Roth, who is our Patron of the Week. Thanks so much for your support. We've just updated our benefits on Patreon, and all patrons now get early access to our videos completely ad and sponsor free. You can also get regular updates about what we're up to behind the scenes, and have the chance to vote in polls that drive our content, and submit questions for our Q&A videos on the Intel Report. If you want to be part of our Patreon community and get access to Patreon exclusive benefits, follow the link in the description below.